First Samuel 29. First Samuel 29. Good to see everybody. Ann was not feeling well. I hope Donna has her extension cord tonight. That's a joke between Donna and I, so if she's listening, I'll get it. So that's good. I'll get a response. So that's good. Hope he's feeling better though soon. And good to hear the news. Talked to Linda. Well, I talked to Linda. I texted y'all yesterday. And that plus what she sent to the elders and I today. So do want to remember Larry, Mom, all those that Jay mentioned. Prayers. First Samuel 29. We're nearing the end. As I said last week, we will soon end this. We will start a topical study. May do 2 or 3 different topical studies before we get back into the text. And don't want to wear anybody out in any direction, shape, form, or fashion. And so we'll do whatever everyone thinks best along those lines. As long as we're studying the Bible, that's important. 1 Samuel 29, the Philistines are going to reject David. We know a little bit of the story with regards to Saul has been mercilessly hunting David. And as he's hunted David, he has wanted to kill him. David has had opportunity on more than one occasion to take the life of Saul. But out of deep respect for Saul's position and maybe even for life itself, David chosen not to do. David gets to a point in the 26th chapter and 27th chapter where he has to find refuge somewhere. So he goes in and finds that refuge in and amongst the Philistines. Now, remember this, that when he did that, he was still loyal to the Israelites, children of Israel. That he was, in essence, you might say, sort of using the Philistines as cover to protect him from Saul. But at the same time, too, he was sort of a spy for the children of Israel in the midst of the Philistines. And there was a leader, if you will, by the name of Achish. We'll see it here in just a minute. But Achish believed David and took David as a confidant, as a friend, and believed that David was helping him and faithful and loyal to him and thus to the Philistines. And so what then transpires in this 29th chapter is interesting because it carries over into the 30th chapter in many ways, is that David's going to hit a wall, so to speak. That's the way I see it. And you may see it a little differently. But when we get into the 30th chapter, David really hits a wall because of the rejection of the Philistines. He comes back and he finds everything gone. Everything that his soldiers had, their families, their possessions. And when you stop and think about that, and one of the things that I think is key in what we're studying tonight, and probably then again next week we get into the 30th chapter, is that David's men really were voluntary army. They came of their own accord. They were evidently very skilled, and in many ways, at least when I think about it and when I read 1 Samuel, I often think of them almost as being mercenaries. Maybe that's a little tough on David's men. But David has this band of some 600 men that have gone with him and fought with him. And that's important. In the 28th chapter, the chapter we studied last week, we see where Saul goes and visits a medium, often called in some of our more modern day versions a witch. the witch at Endor, the medium at Endor, to invoke Samuel because he feels like God has left him and God will not answer his prayers. We switch, and so the last bit of this book of 1 Samuel switches back and forth between Saul and David, and now we switch to David and this rejection by the Philistines. And so the Philistines gathered together all their armies at Aphek, and the Israelites encamped by a fountain which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines passed in review by hundreds and by thousands. David and his men passed in review at the rear with Achish. Now, one of the things to catch here is the word lords that's found here in verse 3 and then again in verse 9, we see the word princes. Different Hebrew words, but probably referring back to the same group of people. Commanders in the Philistine army. The difference is the word lords that's found in verse 2 is actually, when you get into the original text that we have, is actually a borrowed word from the Philistines, whereas the word that's translated princess in verses 3 and verse 9 is actually a Hebrew word. And so why does the author do that? Who knows? It's, like I say, referring to the same folks, the commanders of the Philistines. And it's sort of a military review. There's a review. They pass by a review by hundreds, by thousands. But David and his men, they're at the back end. And then the princess of the Philistines said, what are these Hebrews doing here? So certain commanders, they're asking the question, what are David's men doing here? It leads us to wonder. And that's all what I'm about to say is. It's a wonder which I don't know the answer to. And the wonder is that while Achish had taken David in, you wonder if it had not been spread throughout the land of Palestine, the Philistines, that David was in their camp, because they asked the question, what's he doing here? And Achish said to the princes of the Philistines, is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me these days or these years? And to this day, I have found no fault in him since he defected to me. Now, think about what he said. He realizes who he's got. He realizes who's on his side. And notice that he makes the statement that he's the servant of Saul, king of Israel. But notice at the end of the verse, he says he's defected to me. He's come over to our side. And so he says, look, he's been with me. And this is an interesting statement. This is sort of an idiomatic statement. He says, he's been with me for these days or these years. We would say it like this. He's been with me for about a year or two. Nothing definite, just kind of, he's been with me. So he realizes who he has. This is not something from the standpoint of, oh, this is a new revelation to me. I didn't realize who I had. I would let him be in here. He realizes who's been a part of his army, who's been with him, fighting, helping him. And he says, the text says, verse 4, but the princes of the Philistines were angry with him. So the princes of the Philistines said to him, make this fellow return, that he may go back to the place which you've appointed for him, and do not let him go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become our adversary. For with what could he reconcile himself to his master, if not with the heads of these men? I wonder if they knew more than Achish did. Because David has sort of, as we said, sort of spy for the Israelites in the Philistines at this time. Maybe the princes knew more, the commanders knew more than Achish did, although seemingly David was with Achish and served under Achish. They realize, though, that they don't want David with them, because if David's with them and David picks them off and David carries, if you will, their hide back, and I use that not belittling them, because we're going to see as we continue here, by the time we get to the end of this chapter, we're going to see how they treated folks that they killed and war prisoners, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But the delight would that bring to those folks? And so we don't want him with us. Is this not David, of whom they sang to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? They know of David's celebrity. David was, of course, the one that killed Goliath. They know of that. That news had spread around. Well, how did it spread around? Well, remember that they had paraded that head. They had carried it around. That was a common practice. Fame had spread. Folks knew. The Philistine land, in and of itself, as we've talked about from a geographical or geography standpoint, is much in the middle of Israel. It's sort of down, if you will, northeast of Egypt, and it crept up into what we would consider Palestine, say of Jesus' day, and it had a couple of fingers that even spread even further north. And so their land was kind of in the middle of the Israelites, and so it's not strange that they would have some information about David because of what he'd done and what people had said. So Achish, verse 6, called David and said to him, surely as the Lord lives. This is kind of an oath. In other words, he's not just saying something, he's sort of taking, surely as the Lord lives. Now, isn't that interesting? He doesn't, Achish being a Philistine, his God would have been Dagon. We saw Dagon earlier in this book. And so why in the world, as he invokes this oath, he uses the Lord? Don't know. Could it be that he realizes David is hearing this and he wants David to understand what he's thinking and maybe feel at ease? Is it that he has accepted, and I don't think this is a possibility, but still, is it the fact that he has accepted the Lord and turned against Dagon? No, it's just kind of interesting, though, that he goes out of his way to sort of, maybe I think, sort of placate David and says, as the Lord, you have been upright, and you're going out and you're coming in with me, and the army is good in my sight. For to this day I have not found evil in you since the day of your coming to me. Nevertheless, the Lord's do not favor you. He says, the way I see it, you've been faithful. He says, you've been faithful to me. You're going out and you're coming in. You're good. I've not found evil in you since you've joined me. He says, I believe you're on my side. But these commanders over here don't believe it. They want you gone. They don't want you as part of our groups. They don't favor you. Therefore, verse 7, return now and go in peace, that you may not displease the Lord of the Philistines, that you may not displease these commanders. It's interesting, isn't it? How we often try to make people happy. Now, I get why he had to, why Achish had to, why he needed to. You can't let your army go out and you've not listened to them as commanding officer. You've not listened to what they've said. You've not taken into consideration your commanding officers under you. You want to do what they want done because you want them to be successful. But nevertheless, we do tend to try to listen to people, and we do try to sometimes go overboard, or we trying to do. So he sends David away and his men. And in sending David away, he tells them in such a nice way. It's not me, David, it's them. We usually throw people under the bus, right? It's not my fault, it's somebody else's. And so he says, it's theirs, their reason, but we're going to make them happy. We might say it this way, we mad. But David said, Achish, but what have I done? And to this day, what have you found in your servant as long as I have been with you, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my Lord the king? David is at a loss. Now, you might say, well, is David acting? Or is David really at a loss? Why in the world won't they let us go with them? Does David really feel like this was an important mission and he needed to be there? Who knows? But David still asked this question. What am I doing? Why can't I go? It's interesting that David mentions that I may not go and fight against the enemies of the Lord my king. David and his soldiers fighting me. That's what they did. That was, you might say, well, that's kind of brutal and ugly and nasty, and yeah, but that's what they did. And so David said, why can't I go and fight? Then Achish answered and said to David, I know that you're good. Or excuse me, I know that you are as good in my sight as an angel of God. Kind of interesting, isn't it? You're as good in my sight as an angel of the Lord, a messenger of the Lord. He shall not give up with us. David had been loyal, and Achish felt that David had been loyal. But the princes have said he's not going to go. Now, we really don't know why they have said this. One commentator said that there were troublemakers, if you will, from Manasseh that had entered into David's fold about this time. And look, this is according to a passage in 1 Chronicles. And that thus, consequently, they may have been the reason that these commanders didn't want David to go. We really don't know. It seems as if they were more afraid that David would do something to them, at least from what they said about verse 6 and 7, than they were afraid, say, to go in battle. Now, therefore, rise early. Achish is now telling David, rise early in the morning with your master's servants who have come with you. And as soon as you're up early in the morning, have light, depart. Go back home. Go back to where I told you. So David and his men rose early to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. This chapter is not about teaching us any principles. It really doesn't hold anything other than, I think you could say, well, Achish did throw the commanding officers under the bus, but at the same time, too, he did send David home kind of in a nice way. And in many ways, you might say, well, Was this an act of God to spare David from going to fight certain folks that were beloved of God? Could be. Could be. What happens, though, in this chapter is what really sets us up for in the 29th chapter, or in the 30th chapter, where David and his men come back and ultimately are discouraged. In many ways, as we've talked about quite a few times, it's some that this is where this chapter should end, but in reality, this chapter flows into the 30th chapter, and they probably should all be one chapter, but it doesn't really matter. It's just a matter of continuity and reading of the text. Anything anybody like to say about the 29th chapter before we move into the 30th chapter?
Leader, telling David to leave. Go back to the 14th chapter. We got the Philistines into kind of the confusion. There were some Hebrews living. They left and went to the side. And so maybe that's just what they were thinking back on. This crazy stuff happened in the past when y'all were over here. So, but that sends you away again.
Yeah. Good point. Could be. Could be. Anything else? Well, as we enter the 30th chapter, we understand now David is going back to that which he has been assigned. To keep in mind something, though, is important. In the 27th chapter, you might recall we saw David raid the Amalekites. Okay? Just keep that little bit in mind as we enter now into the 30th chapter. It happened when David and his men came to Ziklag. The best we can tell, this was probably an 80-mile journey. Notice on the third day, they made it in 3 days. That's fascinating, and that's fast. A day's journey for, the Bible talks about so-and-so went on a day's journey. A day's journey was considered 20 miles. And so, in 3 days, you're talking about 60 miles. These fellows went 80 miles. So they went full speed. They didn't hold anything back. They weren't looking around at the scenery or talking. They were headed on. On the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, attacked Ziklag, burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and those who were there, from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but carried them away and went their way. All right, so here we have basically David coming back and the Amalekites coming into the camp. Because think about this. David takes his 600 men. Now they're married. Sure, there's some children involved there. There are also spoils as they have gone from place to place, and they have been victors. They have gathered spoils. They have things. Now, it wasn't like us moving because we have bunches of stuff, right? But they had things, and they've been left behind, and the Amalekites have come, and basically they've taken everything. Burned what's good, taken everything else that they could. Everything wasn't tied down. They took even the women and children. They didn't kill anybody. Now, we might say, well, why in the world wouldn't they kill them? Well, the Philistines were noted to take anybody, any individual. They would take them down to Egypt and sell them as slaves. Have you ever wondered, of course, we're still a little bit past it. Have you ever wondered how the pyramids were made? They were made with hand labor, slaves. And they had a bunch of them. Well, the Philistines, if they captured anybody, they wouldn't kill them. They'd take them down to Egypt. They'd sell them on the slave market, and so they didn't keep anyone their way, and they went their way. So David came to the city, and there it was, burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, daughters, taken captive. Now, imagine, if you will, you've gone to do what you know to do, fight, and you've been turned around, you've been turned away. Nope, don't want you. And so on your journey home, all you can think about is home. I give you, for instance, a lot of preachers have talked about this. I remember one time I held a gospel meeting in Talladega, Alabama, and I preached Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Yeah, just 3 days, 4 days altogether. But I had 4 different lessons on Sunday, and I had 2 different lessons Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I was worn out from preaching. But I didn't leave Wednesday night. I stayed and left Thursday morning. Went to bed fairly early Wednesday night after I got home from church. Went to bed and got up, and I was on the road about the time daybreak. Had to get back to Dixon, had to get back to my office. But the whole way up 65, all I could think about was Sue and Ethan and getting home, getting back and see family. Now these fellas get there and they find the city burned, children, wives gone, possessions gone, nothing. They're dejected from the rejection of the Philistines. They're dead tired because of the trip. And now they find nothing. They're not happy. Shouldn't be happy. David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. This is verse 4. Their grief is deep. Now, grief, as we've talked about, or I've talked about before, grief comes at the loss of anything. Their grief is the loss of family, loss of possessions, loss of in many ways their purpose because they can't fight or couldn't fight. They are distraught. And you also got to understand that folks in that area, in that day and age, when they grieved heavy. And so they are very distraught with their grief. And David, verse 5, 2 wives, Ahinoam and Jezreelites, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, Carmelite, had been taken captive. So David lost his family as well. And David, notice what it says, was greatly distressed. Greatly distressed. Wasn't a little bit, wasn't some, but was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him. David has the grief, loss of family. Now, David is going to feel, or is feeling, the loss possibly of his army. David has kept his army together through thick and thin. David has proved to this point, at least as you stop and think about it, David has proved to be a really good leader. Because one of the wonderful traits of leadership and leading is that a good leader is able to keep folks together even in the midst of distress and trials and problems. And David has, but now David is really challenged. Because he's lost everything, he has that grief, but he's also got soldiers that are after him, folks that he knew and loved. I'll give you another story. Back in 2006, I held a gospel meeting at the congregation where I grew up in Tennessee. And my father was still an elder at the time. He was still alive. And anyway, I held a gospel meeting. Well, sort of the rule of thumb is you got to feed the preacher in different congregations. But I was invited. Folks either took me out or took me into their home, and Dad was one of, I think there were 6, 7 guys that were elders at Main Street at the time. And one of the elders was a fellow that I've known all my life, or most of my life, but he was the assistant principal at the high school, Mr. Brady. Now, I got along fine with Mr. Brady. I had no problems with Mr. Brady. I stayed out of trouble because I knew he'd tell Harold to tell Daddy in a minute. And but Harold was a former Marine, strict disciplinarian, straight line. You walk that line, you do what you're supposed to, do-da. And so anyway, Harold and his lovely wife, Miss Doris, had not just me over for supper before one of the night services, they had Mom and Dad. We're sitting there eating, and Mr. Brady asked me, he said, Paul? I said, yes, sir. He said, did you ever think when you were in high school that you'd sit at the same table with me and eat? I said, nope. Not only did I not think about it, didn't want to do it. And so we had a great conversation. He was a good man. We had a great conversation. But I remember in the midst of that conversation, he said, probably, I don't know that, your dad and I, we would have been friends like we are. I said, yeah, okay. How you figure? He said, well, as elders, when you go into that office, he said, and the decisions you have to make and the things you have to go through and sort through and the things you have to talk about. I said, yeah. He said, they just bond you together. The things that you've gone through together as fellow elders. I said, oh, yeah, I'm full aware of that. And so when I read this and think of this, I think of that story. David and his men are truly bonded. They have gone through a lot. But David is greatly distressed, for the people have talked of stoning him because the soul of all the people was grieved. The word grieved here is the idea they are in bitterness. It's not that their feelings are hurt. They are bitter. Being bitter, they're discomforted, they're angry, they're discontented, if it was mad, that's what they were. Every man for his sons and his daughters. David, now here comes the good part. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. It's interesting because beginning right here, especially going, well, really through verse 16, in many ways is a great description of how you overcome discouragement and heartache and disappointment. How do you do it? Well, number one, you trust in God. What did he do? He turned to God. He strengthened himself in the Lord God. Then David said to Abiathar, the priest. Now Abiathar was the last of the Eliad priests. Chapter 22 and chapter 23, all of them done away with. But Abiathar was evidently the last. Still, Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, David said to him, please bring the ephod here to me. And remember, now we've talked about this, but just to remind you, the ephod was sort of a mantle, or breastplate, if you will, that the high priest wore over his garments. It had stones in it. Those stones represented usually the 12 tribes of Israel, but also there was in the ephod, there was pouch. And in that pouch was the Urim and the Thummim. Remember, we've talked about, you pull it, you'd ask questions and pull it out, pull the stone out, depending upon which it was. That was the answer that was given. And that was always seen as God's answer. And so when David said, bring the ephod here to me. What he's saying is, I need some answers from God. What do you need? Well, Abiathar brought the ephod to David. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? So David, first of all, to overcome discouragement, David, first of all, trusts the Lord. In discouragement, that's the first thing you have to do. You have to learn who are we going to trust? A lot of folks get discouraged. What do? They quit the church. A lot of folks get discouraged. The first thing they want to do is they want to blame God. The second thing they want to do is they want to say, well, not only am I going to blame God, but I'm going to figure this out myself. I don't know how many folks, one's too many, and unfortunately it's been more than one, that I have talked to through the years, 40 years of ministry, that have decided to quit the church. Well, why have you quit? Well, either something in the church or something in life smacked them upside the head the wrong way, sadly. And they are discouraged, disappointed, disgruntled, upset. And so they began, first of all, to trust themselves and try to answer their problems themselves. But notice what David does. David says, no, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to go to him in prayer. I need to know his answer. And here's my question. Shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. So he's given a promise. And the promise is, I'm going to be with you. You're going to win. Guess what? We got the same promise. We got the same promise. Romans chapter 8, the whole chapter really, I think is in many ways that promise, but especially you get down to the end where he talks about we're more than conquerors through him that loved us. Right there at the end of chapter 8. We have that promise of victory. David is promised of victory. We're promised of the presence of God, because in Romans 8, you go back to verse 31, what does Paul say? If God be for us, who can be against us? He that spared not his own son, delivered him up for us all. How shall he not also freely give us all things? God's on our side. David is seeing that. So David went, he and 600 men who were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those stayed who were left behind. David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 stayed behind, who were so weary they could not cross the brook Besor. All right, well, we're going to stop. I want to talk about this, but I want to stop right there because I want to come back to this idea of discouragement, disappointment, and talk more about it. But I want us to think about what's happening, and we'll review, and we will more than likely finish 1 Samuel next week. But notice he says, David, he and the 600 men who were with him came to the brook where those stayed who were left behind. David took 400 men with him. 200 stayed behind. The grief, sorrow, the travel, and these were fighting men. So these were men that knew how to fight, could fight all day long if they needed to. These were men of strength and stamina, but yet they've reached their max. 200 of them have. We just need to stay here. And so David lets them stay. That's important. It's important. It doesn't have anything to do with overcoming discouragement per se, but it does tell us that there are times in our lives where we reach the maximum. We can't go any further. We can't do any more. And what we're going to see as we conclude the book next week, what we're going to see is that David is going to treat them very well. And we'll explain why and how. But David doesn't take it out on him. Now, some of the other fellows want to, but David doesn't. But think about, read, especially if you get a little time, read verses 11 through 16. We're going to talk about this, the last, I think, point that we can draw out of these verses with regards to overcoming discouragement. Well, what you've got really is you've got David finding people as he finds the priest, David praying to God, David being assured of the promises of God in the presence of God. All helps us in our disappointment. Like I say, I want to talk a little bit more about disappointment and discouragement next week. But anything else anybody like to say or add? Any questions or comments? Powerful word. I'm so thankful for this day, thankful for the opportunity to study your word. Thankful for what it means to us, a lamp to our feet and a light to our path, for how we can learn. Yea, this simple story of what we can do when we feel down and out and discouraged. We're thankful for David, for the life they lived, the service that he gave your people. Help us to truly be servants in your kingdom, to do what we can to further your kingdom. We ask that you watch over us, that you bless us and keep us. Forgive us of our sins. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. All right, we'll finish this book next week. We'll probably have a little extra time at the end, and so we'll kind of do a review, and then we'll get into something else next week. Now, let's see, this is technically the second Wednesday of November, so next week will be the third. Now, the fourth Wednesday of November will be the Thanksgiving, and so we won't have class. We'll have I hadn't talked to y'all, but we always have short devotional on the fourth Wednesday. Jordan, it's not the fourth. That won't be the fourth Wednesday. It may not be, but the fourth Wednesday night we won't have class. We'll have devotional, and then we'll eat together. And yes, yeah, that's where I'm confused. That's where I was confused too. I was looking at my calendar the other day. Yes, but so that's where we're headed. If you care, you know, sorry, didn't mean to take up your time. Anyway, love you. Hope you have a great week. Be careful out there in the rain.